It was into this town, on a Wednesday afternoon in the autumn of 1878, that Rourke Callahan rode. He came from the south, out of the desert, alone, on a dark bay horse that looked like it had been ridden hard for several days and had opinions about it. Rourke himself looked like something the desert had been chewing on and had reluctantly spat back out. He was 34 years old, though the last 3 years had done the work of 10 on his face. He was lean in the particular way that comes not from hunger but from the complete burning away of anything unnecessary, leaving only the functional, hard jaw, hard eyes, hands that rested on the saddle horn, with a stillness that was not relaxation but its opposite. His eyes were the color of old gunmetal, and they moved constantly, cataloging everything without appearing to look at anything directly. He wore a single Remington revolver on his right hip, worn low and tied down, the leather of the holster darkened and softened by years of use. The gun was not a decoration and was not meant to look like one. There was a long knife on his left hip and a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard, and the combined arrangement spoke the quiet professional language of a man who intended to be prepared for several different kinds of trouble simultaneously. His coat was a dark canvas duster, road gray with dust, and beneath it he wore a plain dark shirt with a collar that sat high enough to partially obscure a scar that ran from his left jaw down to his collarbone, a scar with a story attached that he had never in his life told completely to any single person. He rode down Caldwell Crossing's main street at a walk, not looking at the people on the boardwalks who were looking at him, and stopped in front of the livery stable. A boy of perhaps 12 came out and looked up at the horse, and then up at the man with the wide, calibrating eyes of a child who has learned to read strangers quickly as a survival skill. Water and grain, Rourke said, dismounting with the stiff, careful movement of a man managing several old injuries simultaneously. Good hay if you have it. She's earned it. He handed the reins to the boy and reached into his coat pocket and produced a coin. That was more than the service was worth. The boy looked at the coin. Then he looked at the man. "You stayin' long, mister?" he asked. Rourke considered the question with more apparent seriousness than it probably warranted. "That depends," he said, "on what I find when I start looking." He took his Winchester from the scabbard, shouldered his saddlebag, and walked toward the saloon without looking back. The town of Caldwell Crossing sat at the edge of the New Mexico territory like a bad tooth in a broken jaw, painful, unavoidable, and long overdue for removal. It was the kind of place that had been built in a hurry, by men with no intention of staying, and had then been inherited by men with no ability to leave. The main street was a single long wound of packed dirt and horse manure running between 2 rows of weathered buildings that leaned toward each other, overhead as though whispering. There was one saloon, one general store, one church that doubled as a jail on Saturday nights, and one undertaker who was by far the most consistently employed businessman in the territory. The undertaker's name was Pemberton, and he had the cheerful, unhurried manner of a man whose customers always eventually came to him. The saloon was called the Rusted Spur, and it lived up to its name. The interior was dim and smelled of spilled beer, tobacco, and the particular human sourness of men who worked outdoors in physical labor and bathed irregularly. There were 6 men inside, 4 at a card table, one asleep against the far wall with his hat over his face, and one standing at the bar with the specific, rigid posture of a man who is drinking with deliberate, methodical intent rather than social purpose. The bartender was a wide, flat-faced man named Decker, who had the permanently suspicious expression of someone who had been lied to professionally for 20 years. Rourke put his back to the bar and his eyes on the room. "Whiskey," he said to Decker without looking at him. "And information if it's cheap." Decker poured without comment and waited. "I'm looking for a man named Aldrich Cole," Rourke said. Something happened in the saloon. It was subtle, a slight stiffening at the card table, a barely perceptible pause in the rhythm of the room, but Rourke felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Decker's expression didn't change, but his eyes did something behind it. "Don't know that name," Decker said. Rourke picked up his whiskey glass and looked at its contents. "That's interesting," he said quietly, "because 3 different people between here and the Rio Grande told me that Caldwell Crossing was where I'd find him." He set the glass down without drinking. "So either they were all wrong or you're lying to me." He turned his gunmetal eyes to Decker. "Which do you think is more likely?" The saloon was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved down the empty street and stirred the dust and found nothing worth staying for. Rourke stood at the bar in the dim yellow light and waited, with the absolute patience of a man who has been waiting for 3 years and has learned that patience is simply another form of violence. Decker held Rourke's gaze for approximately 4 seconds, which was about 3 seconds longer than most men managed. Then something shifted in the flat geography of his face, not fear exactly, but the close relative of it, the pragmatic recalibration of a man who is reassessing the cost-benefit of a lie he has already told. He picked up a glass and began wiping it with a cloth that was not going to make it any cleaner, which was a bartender's universal gesture for buying time to think. "Cole ain't here," Decker said finally. His voice dropped low enough that it didn't carry to the card table. "Hasn't been here in maybe 6 weeks." Rourke said nothing, which was its own form of pressure. Decker kept wiping the glass. "He came through here with 3 men, stayed 2 nights. There was an incident." He paused. "A family. The Harmon family, out on the Eastern Road. Cole and his men rode out that direction on the 2nd morning, and when they came back, they had Harmon's wagon and Harmon's horses and Harmon's strongbox." Another pause. "The Harmons weren't seen after that." The sleeping man against the far wall had stopped snoring. Clara noticed, which meant he wasn't sleeping anymore. One of the card players had his hand resting on the table closer to his hip than it had been 30 seconds ago. Rourke processed all of this without visible reaction. "Where did Cole go after?" he said. "North," Decker said. "Toward the San Cristobal range. That's all I know." He met Rourke's eyes with the careful, calibrated honesty of a man offering exactly as much truth as he calculated was safe. "And the 3 men with him," Rourke said. 2 of them were Dorado brothers. Fence and Pike. Mean as anything the territories produced, which is saying something. The 3rd one I didn't recognize. Young, maybe 20, blonde, quiet in the way that's worse than loud. Rourke straightened from the bar and picked up his Winchester. He reached into his pocket and produced another coin, and set it beside his untouched whiskey glass. "You've been helpful," he said to Decker. Then he turned to the room. The man against the wall had his hat back from his face now and was watching openly. The card player with his hand near his hip had turned in his chair. Rourke looked at them both with his gunmetal eyes. "I'm going to sleep in your town tonight," he said to the room at large. In the same conversational tone he'd used with Decker, "I'm going to leave in the morning. Anyone who tries to get a message to Cole or the Dorados before I ride out is going to have a problem they won't enjoy." He paused. "That's not a threat. It's just information. Do with it what you want." He walked to the door and pushed out into the street, and behind him the saloon exhaled slowly like a held breath finally released. Outside, the afternoon had begun its long collapse toward evening. The light was going red and flat across the desert flats west of town, and the temperature was dropping with the speed it always dropped in the high desert. Sudden and certain. Rourke stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street and thought about the Harmon family and the strongbox and what a man like Aldrich Cole needed from a farming family's strongbox badly enough to leave no witnesses. There was only one answer that made sense, and it made Rourke's jaw tighten in that familiar way. The way it had been tightening for 3 years, ever since the night in Socorro, when everything he had built and everyone he had protected had been taken from him in the space of 2 hours by a man who smiled while he worked. He had been hunting Aldrich Cole for 3 years. He had started with nothing. No money, no allies, no proof of anything. Only the memory of that night in Socorro burned into him with the permanence of a brand. He had built his case slowly and carefully and at great personal cost, following Cole's trail from town to town across the territory, accumulating evidence the way a careful man accumulates debt, one piece at a time, each one a weight he carried forward. He knew Cole's methods now, his patterns, his weaknesses, the specific shape of the evil the man practiced. Cole was not a simple outlaw. He was something more organized and more dangerous, an operator, a man who used violence as a business tool and kept careful account of his investments and returns. He worked for larger interests, the way a sharp instrument works for the hand that holds it. The larger hand, Rourke had come to believe, belonged to an organization he had only recently begun to identify by name. The Covenant, a network of land speculators, corrupt officials, and hired violence that was quietly consolidating territory across New Mexico and Colorado, with a patience and a methodology that spoke of serious money and serious ambition behind it. Cole was the Covenant's primary instrument in the field. Finding Cole meant finding the edge of a thread that, if pulled carefully enough, might unravel something much larger. Rourke was not operating under any illusions about what that meant for his personal survival prospects. He had made his peace with the odds a long time ago. He thought about his wife, Elena, and his daughter, Rosa, and the peace he had made cracked slightly, as it always did when he thought of them, and then he assembled it back together with the deliberate, practiced care of a man who cannot afford to let it stay broken. He had work to do. He walked back toward the livery stable to check on his horse and plan. His route north toward the San Cristobal Range, and the red desert light went dark behind him, like a door being shut.
He left Caldwell Crossing before dawn, in the specific pre-light darkness that exists in the high desert, like a held breath between night and morning, absolute black overhead, fading to a deep bruised purple at the eastern horizon, the air cold and perfectly still and carrying the smell of sage and dry rock. His bay horse rested and fed, moved out of the livery with recovered energy, her hooves on the packed dirt road making the only sound in the sleeping town. Rourke rode north and let the silence work on him the way silence in open country always did, cleaning out the accumulated interior noise, sharpening the edges of his thinking, returning him to the clean, functional state. That was his closest approximation of peace. The road north from Caldwell Crossing was not much of a road. It was a suggestion. Two wheel ruts in the scrub that faded and reasserted themselves across the rocky ground as the terrain changed. After 2 hours of riding, it abandoned the pretense entirely and became simple open country, rising gradually toward the dark mass of the San Cristobal Range that sat across the northern horizon like a broken wall. The San Cristobals were not the dramatic snow-capped peaks of the northern ranges. They were older and lower and harsher, dark red rock and loose shale and deep arroyos carved by flash floods, covered in sparse juniper and twisted pinon, pine that clung to the rock faces with the grim tenacity of things that have learned to survive on almost nothing. It was country that did not forgive errors of navigation or judgment. Rourke had a map, hand-drawn on the back of a wanted notice, obtained from a Mexican vaquero named Tres, who had worked these ranges for 20 years and knew every water source and box canyon between the Rio Grande and the Colorado border. Tres had drawn the map in exchange for a bottle of mezcal and had done so with the careful, loving detail of a man rendering something he genuinely respected. Rourke had studied it for 3 evenings and had it memorized, well enough to navigate without consulting it, but he kept it in his breast pocket anyway, close to his chest. Old habits. At mid-morning he found the first sign. It was subtle, the kind of thing that passes unnoticed by eyes that haven't been trained to look for it. A scorched circle in the scrub, maybe 30 feet across, at the base of a low rocky rise. Old fire, maybe 5 weeks gone, which aligned with Decker's timeline. The ash had blown and scattered, but the scorching of the earth beneath was permanent. Someone had made a large fire here, larger than a traveling camp needed. Around the perimeter of the scorched area, in the loose soil between the rocks, Rourke found boot prints. Several sets, at least 4 men, moving in patterns that suggested not rest but activity, back and forth, purposeful. And at the far edge of the circle, half buried under a slide of loose shale that had come down the rise, sometime after the event, he found what he had been afraid he would find: a hand. The skeletal remains of a human hand, fingers curled upward from the shale, the bones yellowed and picked, cleaned by the scavengers that worked these high desert reaches with quiet efficiency. Rourke dismounted and stood beside it for a moment. Then he crouched and looked at it carefully without touching it. The size and bone structure told him adult, male, large-framed. He looked at the shale slide above and understood that the rest of what remained of this person was under there. He looked at the scorched earth and understood something else. He stood up and looked north toward the dark ridgeline of the San Cristobals. Cole had not just robbed the Harmon family. He had used this place for something else, something that required a large fire and privacy, and enough distance from Caldwell. Crossing that, the smoke wouldn't be seen. Rourke's jaw was doing its familiar tightening. He thought about the strong box and what might have been in it, that Cole valued enough to take this kind of step, out here in open country where taking a step like this was easy and anonymous and permanent. A land deed, most likely, the Harmon family's land claim. If the Covenant was consolidating territory in this range, a legitimate land deed held by a farming family would be an obstacle. Small, easily removed, permanently resolved by a large fire at the base of a rocky rise in country that no one visited. He remounted and rode north, and he carried the image of that hand with him the way he carried everything silently, adding it to the weight, converting it into forward motion. Behind him, a pair of ravens, settled onto the shale slide with the unhurried authority of creatures who knew that patience was always rewarded in country like this. The San Cristobal Range grew larger and darker against the sky as he rode toward it, its ridgeline cutting a jagged line across, the blue like a wound that hadn't healed cleanly and never would.
The spring at Agua, Fria, was marked on Tress's map with a small blue circle and the notation Buena Agua, good water, which in this country was as significant a landmark as a town. It sat in a narrow cleft between two red rock faces about 3 miles into the foothills, a thin seep of clear cold water that collected in a natural stone basin before trickling away south into the scrub. The juniper trees around it were greener and fuller than anything else in the immediate landscape, advertising its presence to anyone who knew how to read the color of desert vegetation. Rourke spotted the green from a quarter-mile out and approached, with the automatic caution that any water source in difficult country warranted. Other travelers stopped at water, and other travelers covered the full spectrum from benign to fatal. He came in from the uphill side, dismounted 50 yards out, and led his horse in quietly on foot, keeping to the rock faces and reading the basin before he committed to it. What he found was not what he expected. Sitting beside the stone basin, with her back against the red rock face and a rifle across her knees, was a woman. She was perhaps 28, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had started handsome and been made harder and more particular by outdoor life and difficult circumstance. She wore trail clothes, practical, worn, no concessions to anything but function, and the rifle on her knees was a Henry repeater that she was holding with the ease of long familiarity. She had heard him coming. Her eyes were already on him when he rounded the last rock, face with his Winchester in hand. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The spring trickled into its basin. A small bird worked the juniper branches above the woman's head, indifferent to the loaded silence below it. Rourke kept his Winchester at a low carry and his eyes on her hands. Her hands stayed still on the Henry. "You came in quiet," she said finally. Her voice was steady and direct, the voice of someone who had decided some time ago that being frightened was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Habit," Rourke said. "Is the water shared or claimed?" The woman looked at him for another moment with dark eyes that were doing the same kind of rapid assessment he was doing. "Shared," she said. "Sit if you want. I'm not in a position to be choosy about company right now." He watered his horse and filled his canteen, and sat on a rock across the basin from her, keeping the water between them and his rifle within reach, which she noticed and did not comment on because she was doing the same thing. "You're on the Caldwell Road," she said. "Coming from the south?" "Yes," he said. "And you?" She looked at the ridgeline above them. "Coming from the north, the hard way." Something in how she said it communicated clearly that the hard way had not been chosen voluntarily. Rourke looked at her more carefully. There was a cut above her right eye, maybe 2 days old and poorly cleaned. And the way she was sitting against the rock had a careful quality that suggested a rib or two were giving her trouble. She had been in a situation recently. "Are you being followed?" he asked. It was a practical question, not a concerned one framed as. Her chin lifted slightly at the directness of it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been moving fast enough that if I am, they haven't caught up yet." She paused. "You?" "No," he said. "Not today." She seemed to accept this answer as adequately precise. A silence passed between them that was not unfriendly. Then she said, "I'm looking for information about a group operating out of the north, San Cristobal's landmen. They came to my family's ranch 3 weeks ago, with papers that didn't match our deed, and 4 men with guns to back the papers up." Rourke went very still in the particular way that meant something she had said had landed on something he already knew. "What did they call themselves?" he said. The woman looked at him. Something in his stillness had communicated itself to her, and her dark eyes were sharper now. "They didn't give a name," she said carefully. "But the man who led them, the one with the papers, he had a ring, a flat silver ring with a mark on it, like a cross inside a circle." Rourke's jaw tightened.
The Covenant's mark. He had seen it once before, on the hand of a man in Socorro who had smiled while he worked. "What's your name?" he said. The woman held his gaze. "Nadia Voss," she said. "My father built the Voss Ranch 20 years ago, on a legal deed registered in Santa Fe, and 3 weeks ago, 4 armed men told him the land had been reclaimed under a territorial consolidation order that I've never found any record of anywhere." Her voice was controlled, but beneath the control was something with heat and weight and permanence. "My father didn't argue with the guns. He's 61 years old, and there were 4 of them." She paused. "I'm arguing for him." Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm Rourke Callahan, and the men who came to your ranch work for the same organization I've been tracking for 3 years." Another silence. The spring trickled. The bird in the juniper moved to a higher branch and sang something, brief and unconcerned. "Then maybe," Nadia Voss said slowly, "we have business to discuss." They talked for 2 hours beside the Agua Fria. Spring, while the desert afternoon peaked and began its slow descent. The shadow of the red rock face creeping across the basin floor by degrees. Rourke laid out what he knew about the Covenant, its methods, its reach, its pattern of operation, in the plain, factual way he organized everything, without editorializing and without omitting the parts that made the situation sound worse than comfortable. He had learned that accurate information, however bleak, was more useful than managed information. Nadia listened without interrupting, which he noted as a quality that was rarer and more valuable than it appeared. The Covenant, as Rourke had been able to establish through 3 years of following its operations, was not a simple criminal organization. It was a business entity operating at the edge of legality, with enough legal cover to make direct challenge nearly impossible. At its surface, it presented as the Meridian Land and Resource Company, a registered corporation out of Santa Fe, with legitimate business filings and political connections that reached into the territorial government. Beneath that surface, it operated through a network of subcontractors, men like Aldrich Cole, who handled the physical work of consolidating land holdings through intimidation, forgery, and, when necessary, the kind of permanent resolution that left skeletal hands, half buried under shale slides in remote arroyos. The strategy was territorial in the most literal sense. The Covenant was assembling a contiguous block of land across the southern New Mexico territory. Ranches, mining claims, water rights, timber holdings, piece by piece, using forged consolidation orders that mimicked legitimate territorial authority closely enough to intimidate farmers and small ranchers, who had neither the legal knowledge nor the financial resources to challenge them. The assembled land would, Rourke believed, be sold or leased to one of the Eastern Railroad, concerns that were pushing west with the specific appetite of organizations that had accurately identified territory as the fundamental currency of the coming century. It was patient, methodical, and enormously profitable, and it was leaving a trail of displaced families and disappeared people across several hundred square miles of territory. Nadia listened to all of this, and when he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, looking at the water in the basin. Then she reached inside her coat and produced a folded paper. "When the men left our ranch," she said, "they took my father's deed and gave him this in exchange." She unfolded it and held it out. Rourke took it and read it carefully. It was a territorial consolidation notice, the same document type he had seen used in 3 previous cases. Official-looking, with a territorial seal and a registrar's signature. He had had a similar document examined by a lawyer in Las Cruces 6 months ago, who had identified it as a sophisticated forgery, distinguishable from a genuine territorial notice only by specific details of the seal that were visible under magnification. "This is forged," he said. "I know," Nadia said, "but knowing it and proving it are different problems." "Yes," Rourke said. He folded the paper and handed it back. "This is evidence. Keep it carefully." She tucked it back inside her coat. "The man who led the group, Cole." "Probably," Rourke said. "Describe him." 40, maybe 45. Medium height, heavy through the shoulders. Dark hair going grey, He had a way of talking, very calm, very reasonable, like a businessman explaining terms of a contract. His eyes were wrong, though. She paused, choosing words. He was smiling, and his eyes weren't participating in it. Rourke felt the familiar tightening in his jaw. "That's Cole," he said. Nadia looked at him. "You've met him." It was not exactly a question. "Once," Rourke said. He did not elaborate, and something in how he said the single word communicated clearly that elaboration was not forthcoming. They talked through the practical situation as the shadows lengthened. Nadia had ridden north from the ranch, intending to reach the San Cristobal foothills and find the camp that Cole and his men had ridden back toward after leaving the Voss property. She had no specific plan beyond finding the camp and establishing its location, which she acknowledged was the beginning of a plan rather than a plan itself. She had the Henry rifle, a good horse she had left hobbled further up the arroyo, 3 days of provisions, and the particular kind of determined anger that burns clean and steady rather than hot and fast. Rourke had a better developed plan, 3 years of intelligence on Cole's operations, and a set of skills that the last 3 years had sharpened to a specific and purposeful edge. The calculation was not complicated. "There's a camp in the northern San Cristobals," Rourke said. "Cole and at least 3 men, one of whom is young and blonde and quiet in a way that means something. They have the Harmon land deed and your family's deed and probably several others. Everything physical that the Covenant holds in this territory passes through Cole's hands before it goes to the Meridian Company offices in Santa Fe." He looked at Nadia. "If we can locate that camp and get to Cole's document case, we have the deeds, we have the forgeries, and we have the chain of evidence that connects Cole to Meridian." Nadia's dark eyes were steady on him. "And Cole himself," she said. "What happens to Cole?" Rourke held her gaze. "Cole answers for what he did to the Harmon family," he said, "and for Socorro." The way he said Socorro, quiet, flat, final, told her that there was a story there that was the center of everything else. And
the northern face of the San Cristobal Range received less sun than the southern approach and held its cold the way old stone holds old memory, deep, stubborn, permanent. Rourke and Nadia rode in single file up a narrow game trail that Tress's map had marked with a small symbol meaning "use carefully," which in Tress's experience, distilled, cartographic language meant that the trail existed, but made no promises about continuing to exist. The juniper and pinon grew thicker here, their twisted forms casting irregular shadows across the shale, and the rock faces on either side of the trail rose in dark red walls that compressed the sky to a narrow corridor of pale blue overhead. Nadia rode well. Rourke noticed this the way he noticed everything useful, quietly, filing it. She kept her horse at the right distance, didn't crowd the trail, and moved with a natural attentiveness to the terrain that spoke of someone who had grown up in this kind of country rather than arrived in it. She kept the Henry across her saddle without being theatrical about it, and her eyes worked the ridge lines above them with the same steady, lateral sweep that Rourke used. She did not talk unnecessarily, which at this stage of a shared enterprise was worth more than most things. They had left Agua Fria, spring in the last of the afternoon light, and were now moving in the early dark of the mountain foothills, navigating by starlight and the thin silver edge of a new moon that was doing its minimal best. The cold had come down fast with the dark, as it always did in the high desert, and their breath made brief, pale shapes in the air. Rourke was running the terrain against Tress's map in his head, tracking their position against a series of landmarks. A distinctive double-peaked rock formation to the northeast, a dry streambed crossing that the map marked as seasonal, a long scree slope that angled down from the main ridge. They were 3 miles into the range and moving toward a high valley that Tress had marked with the notation "good shelter," used by travelers, which in Rourke's current operational framework translated to possible enemy position. He stopped his horse and held up a hand. Nadia stopped immediately and without question. Rourke sat still and listened. The mountain was not silent. Wind in the upper trees, the distant percussion of a loose rock somewhere above, the small nocturnal sounds of things living their lives in the dark. But beneath all of that, at the edge of perception, there was something else. Smoke. Not the clean sage and juniper smell of the desert, but wood smoke with grease in it, cooking fire. Someone had meat on a fire somewhere in the valley ahead. The wind was coming down the mountain toward them, which meant the smoke source was above. He looked. At Nadia. She had caught it too. Her nostrils were slightly flared, and her eyes had sharpened to a particular focus. She looked at him and gave a small nod. She smelled it. They tied the horses in a sheltered draw with good cover and continued on foot, moving up the trail, with the slow, deliberate placement of people who understand that sound travels differently in enclosed terrain, and that one dislodged rock at the wrong moment costs more than 5 minutes of careful progress. Rourke went first with his Winchester, and Nadia followed with the Henry, both of them moving in the crouched, wait-forward posture of people covering ground that might be watched. The smoke smell grew stronger and was joined by the low murmur of voices, not close enough to distinguish words, but close enough to establish number. 3 voices, maybe 4. The fire glow appeared ahead as a dull orange. Warmth reflected off the underside of the pine canopy above the valley's entrance. Rourke went to his stomach, 50 yards from the tree line, and crawled to a position behind a flat granite outcrop that gave him a clear sight line down into the valley. What he saw matched what he had been expecting closely, enough to confirm Decker's information and expand it usefully. The camp was established in the valley floor with the organized permanence of a position that had been occupied for several weeks. Not a traveler's overnight stop, but a base of operations. There were 3 canvas tents, a rope corral holding 6 horses, a fire with a cooking setup over it, and 4 men visible. 3 were sitting around the fire. The 4th was on the valley's eastern edge, standing watch with a rifle, moving in a slow patrol arc that Rourke timed at roughly 8 minutes for a full circuit. He studied the men at the fire carefully. 2 were large and dark, wearing similar coats, the Dorado brothers, Fence and Pike, matching Decker's description. The 3rd was young and blonde, and sat slightly apart from the other 2 with the quiet self-containment of someone who kept their own internal company. The 4th man, the guard, was too far and too dark to read clearly at this distance. There was no 5th figure that matched Cole's description. Cole was not at the fire. Rourke scanned the tents. The center tent was larger than the other 2 and had a lamp burning inside it, its canvas sides glowing amber. A shadow moved across the interior, a single figure, seated, apparently working at something. Cole Rourke recognized the particular stillness of a man who works at a table, the way other men work at nothing at all, completely absorbed, methodical, private. He pulled back from the outcrop and returned to Nadia. He crouched beside her in the dark and spoke in a voice that was less than a whisper, shaped air rather than sound. He described what he had seen. She listened with her face close to his, her eyes on his mouth in the dark. When he finished, she sat back and thought for a moment. 6 horses, she said, the same shaped air delivery. More men than are visible at the fire. Rourke nodded. That had been his first thought too. 4 visible, 6 horses. 2 men unaccounted for, either asleep in the outer tents or positioned elsewhere in the valley as secondary sentries. "We don't go in tonight," he said. She looked at him. Her expression in the thin moonlight was not disappointment, but assessment. She was running the same calculation. He was, and arriving at the same answer. "We watch," she said. He nodded. "We watch, we count, we learn the pattern. Then we go in." They settled into the cold rock of the mountainside and began the patient, uncomfortable, necessary work of watching.
They watched the camp for 2 full nights and 1 complete day, taking turns sleeping in 2-hour rotations in a shallow depression behind the granite outcrop where the rock retained just enough of the day's heat to make the difference between bearable cold and dangerous cold. They ate from Nadia's provisions, dried beef and hardtack and dried apple that tasted extraordinary in the particular way that food always tastes extraordinary when you are eating it in darkness on a cold mountain, while trying not to make noise. By the end of the first night, they had the guard rotation mapped completely. The single patrol on the valley's eastern edge was one man working a consistent 8-minute circuit. There was a second guard on the western approach. Rourke had located him on the second hour of the first watch, a still shape in the rocks that he had initially read as a formation and then revised when the formation moved to adjust its sitting position. This second guard was stationary, which suggested someone who found patrol tedious and had decided that sitting in one place and watching was adequate, which made him both more predictable and less effective than the mobile guard. The rotation shifted at what Rourke estimated as 2-hour intervals, based on the pattern of figures moving to and from the tents. The day between the two nights gave them the daytime picture, which was different from the nighttime one in instructive ways. During daylight, the camp had a businesslike quality. Men moved between the tents and the corral with purpose. Cole emerged from the large center tent twice, once in the morning to speak with the Dorado brothers, once in the afternoon to examine something that one of the unidentified men brought to him on horseback. The afternoon arrival was significant. A rider came in from the south, handed Cole a leather satchel, exchanged brief words, and rode back south within 20 minutes. The Covenant's courier system. Cole received documents, worked on them inside his tent, and at intervals dispatched them via rider. The center tent was the operational hub. The blond young man, or the quiet one, Decker had mentioned, turned out, on observation, to be something specific and concerning. His name, as overheard in a fragment of camp, conversation that drifted up to the outcrop during a wind shift, was Cray. He was Cole's personal aide in some capacity, but his actual function, as Rourke read it through 2 days of behavioral observation, was security. Cray moved through the camp with a loose, unhurried quality that was deceptive. His eyes were always working, always checking angles and positions, and he had a habit of stopping at irregular intervals and simply standing still and listening that indicated real acquaintance and into the working relationship, tactical training rather than amateur alertness. He was the threat that the Dorado brothers, despite their size and reputation, were not. The Dorados were violence. Cray was something more considered. On the second night, Rourke and Nadia lay side by side behind the outcrop in the dark and talked through what they had established. The whispered conversation had a focused, practical quality of two people who have moved past the social formalities of new that shared danger creates. Cole's document case is in the center tent, Rourke said. He works from it at the table. During the day it's open. At night he locks it. I saw him close the clasps last night before the lamp went out. Can you open it? Nadia asked. Depends on the lock. If it's a standard traveling case lock, yes, with time. If it's a custom mechanism, longer. How much time do we have inside the tent before the Eastern Patrol comes around? 8 minutes for a full circuit. He comes within 30 feet of the tent on the closest approach. So we have less than 8 minutes from entry. Less than 6 to be safe. Nadia was quiet for a moment. The Western Guard is the fixed point, she said. He doesn't move, but he has a sight line to the tent entrance. Yes, Rourke said. Someone needs to take him out of the picture before we go in. A pause. I'll handle the Western Guard, Nadia said. It was not a suggestion. Rourke looked at her profile in the moonlight. The clean, hard line of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes on the camp below. You understand what that means, he said. Quietly and completely. I understand, she said. My father is 61 years old, and they took 20 years of his work with forged papers and guns. I understand exactly what it means. Rourke held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Tomorrow night, he said. We go in tomorrow night. The night of the operation came in cold and overcast, which was better than they could have hoped for. The cloud cover killed the moonlight and left the valley in a darkness that was close to complete, broken only by the dim glow of banked coals at the fire pit and the faint amber of Cole's working lamp, visible through the center tent's canvas. Rourke and Nadia had spent the daylight hours, sleeping in rotation and checking their weapons and going over the plan in the detailed, repetitive way that serious people prepare for serious things. not because either of them had forgotten any element of it, but because repetition builds the plan into the muscle and the reflex so that when something unexpected happens, the foundation holds. They moved out from the outcrop position at what Rourke estimated as 2 hours after midnight, when the camp's activity was at its lowest ebb and the guards had been on their current rotation, long enough to have settled into the particular dulled attentiveness of people who have been watching empty darkness for 2 hours without incident. Nadia went left, looping wide around the valley's southern edge toward the Western Guard's fixed position. Rourke went right, moving down the eastern approach in the spaces between the patrol circuit, timing his advances to the 8-minute rhythm he had memorized over 2 nights of watching. He reached the tree line at the valley's edge and stopped, pressed against the rough bark of a pinon, and watched the eastern patrol complete 1 full circuit. The guard was a heavy-set man in a dark coat, moving with the mechanical, glazed quality of someone who had been doing the same walk for many nights and had stopped seeing the terrain, and was only seeing the habitual path through it. When the guard's back was turned at the far arc of the circuit, Rourke moved across the open ground between the tree line and the first tent in a low, fast, silent run that covered the 30 feet in 4 seconds. He pressed himself against the tent's canvas and listened. From the western edge of the valley there was a brief sound, not loud, not prolonged. The specific short sound of a physical confrontation concluded efficiently. Then silence. Nadia had handled the Western Guard. Rourke checked the Eastern Patrol's position, still at the far arc, not yet turning. He moved along the tent line to the center tent's rear and used the thin blade on his knife to ease the rear canvas up from its ground peg, creating a low gap. He went in on his stomach and came up inside. The interior of Cole's tent was organized with the fastidious neatness of a methodical man. A folding table held a lamp burning low, an open ledger book, an inkwell, and a pen. Beside the table, a traveling document case sat closed and clasped. Against the far wall on a folding cot, a figure lay under blankets, breathing in the slow, deep rhythm of genuine sleep. Cole, 4 feet away. Rourke's hand moved to his Remington by pure reflex and stopped there, resting on the grip without drawing. Not yet, the case first. He moved to the table with footsteps that made no sound on the canvas floor and examined the clasps on the document case. Standard brass traveling locks keyed. He took the 2 thin picks from his inside coat pocket and went to work. The first lock took 40 seconds. The second was stiffer and cost him 1:15. He was running his internal clock against the Eastern Patrol circuit, and he was at 4 minutes and closing. The second lock gave, and he opened the case with the slow, controlled care of a man opening something that must not make a sound. Inside, a stack of folded documents, a leather wallet, a small sealed envelope, and beneath everything a flat metal box. He took the documents. First, unfolded the top 3, just far enough to read the headers. Land deeds, the Harmon deed, the Voss deed. 7 others. He refolded them carefully and transferred them to the inside pocket of his duster. The leather wallet went into the left exterior pocket, the sealed envelope into the right. He considered the flat metal box and decided against it. Unknown contents, unknown weight, unknown sound risk. He was at 5 minutes 40 seconds when he reclosed the case and relatched it. He turned toward the rear canvas gap and stopped. On the cot, Cole had shifted. He was now lying on his side, facing the center of the tent, and his eyes were open. Rourke and Aldrich Cole looked at each other across 4 feet of lamplight for the first time since Socorro. Getting Cole out of the camp was the part of the plan that Rourke had spent the least time on, because it was the part that depended most on variables he couldn't control in advance. He had told Nadia before they went in that if Cole was in the tent, he would make a decision in the moment based on what the moment offered. The moment had offered a sleeping man who woke at the wrong time and was now walking in front of Rourke's Remington through the darkness of the camp's rear perimeter, toward the eastern tree line, in the 90 seconds between the patrol's far arc and its return approach. Cole walked with his hands slightly raised and his mouth shut, which was the behavior of a man who was afraid but was managing his fear with the same cold calculation he applied to everything else. He understood the geometry of the situation. Noise meant his men meant Rourke had to shoot. Rourke shooting meant Cole was in the crossfire. It was an arrangement that served both of them, temporarily and neither of them permanently, and both of them understood that. They reached the tree line as the Eastern Patrol's footsteps became audible on the return arc. Rourke put Cole against a tree trunk and held the Remington steady, and they both stood in absolute silence, while the guard passed 30 feet to their left, close enough that Rourke could hear the man's coat brush against the dry grass. Then the footsteps receded and they moved again, up the slope, away from the camp, into the dark mountain. Nadia was waiting at the horses with the Henry across her body and the specific flat expression of someone who has done something difficult and has filed it away and moved past it. She looked at Cole and then at Rourke. "Change of plan," Rourke said. "Necessary," she said. It was not a complaint. She looked at Cole with dark eyes that held something direct and uncomplicated. "You came to my family's ranch," she said. Cole looked at her and his wrong smile adjusted slightly. "Miss Voss," he said with the tone of a man acknowledging a business acquaintance. "Your father was very cooperative." Nadia's jaw tightened visibly, but she said nothing further and turned to her horse. Rourke tied Cole's wrists with a leather cord and put him on one of the horses, his own bay taking the rear position where Rourke could keep eyes on their prisoner at all times. They rode north out of the San Cristobals in the remaining dark hours, pushing as fast as the terrain allowed, because when the camp discovered Cole's absence at the next tent check, which Rourke estimated at 40 minutes to an hour, Cray would take control of the response, and Cray was not a man who would manage it poorly. They needed distance, and they needed it fast. Cole rode in silence for the first hour, which Rourke found more concerning than if he'd been talking. A man who talks when captured is processing fear. A man who stays quiet is making plans. At a rocky overlook where the mountain gave way to the high desert flats, Rourke stopped the horses and dismounted and pulled Cole down and sat him against a rock. The eastern sky was beginning its preparatory lightening. Not yet dawn, but the suggestion of it. A barely perceptible brightening along the horizon's edge. Nadia kept watch on the southern approach with the Henry, while Rourke crouched in front of Cole. "The Covenant," Rourke said. "The full structure. Names, locations, how the money moves, who in the territorial government is on the payroll." Cole looked at him with those wrong eyes and said nothing. Rourke reached into his pocket and laid the documents out on the rock beside Cole. The deeds, the leather wallet, the sealed envelope. Cole looked at them, and something very small and very controlled moved across his face. "You've been busy," he said. 3 years, Rourke said. "Talk to me about the Covenant and I'll make sure you get to a federal court in one piece. That's the only offer you're going to receive." Cole looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Rourke, and his expression shifted, the wrong smile finally going away, replaced by something more naked and more honest and somehow more disturbing. "You don't understand what the Covenant is," he said quietly. "You think it's a land company, a group of corrupt men with money." He shook his head slightly. "Callahan. The Covenant has a territorial judge, 2 members of the Federal Land Commission, and a United States Senator." He paused. "If you take me to a federal court, you're handing me to men who work for the people I work for." The words landed with the specific weight of information that doesn't improve your situation, but changes your understanding of it completely. Rourke held Cole's gaze. The lightening sky behind the mountains was the color of cold iron. "Then we don't go to a federal court," Rourke said. And he began to rethink everything. Yeah. They made camp in a dry wash 20 miles north of the San Cristobals. As the sun came fully up, concealed from any following riders by the wash's steep clay walls, and a thick stand of scrub willow that had found the seasonal water, table somewhere beneath the dry surface. Rourke tied Cole to a willow trunk with enough cord that the man could sit with marginal comfort, but not stand, and left Nadia on watch while he walked 50 yards down the wash and sat on a rock and looked at the desert and thought. The thinking was not comfortable. Cole's information about the Covenant's reach into federal structures had not surprised him exactly. He had suspected something of the kind. But hearing it stated plainly forced a reckoning with the operational reality it created. The conventional path was closed. You didn't take evidence of federal corruption to federal authorities. You didn't take a prisoner with information about a senator to a federal court. Every official channel that should have been the natural destination for what Rourke had spent 3 years assembling was potentially compromised at the point of entry. It was like building a case in a burning building. The structure you needed to deliver it to was the same structure that was on fire. He sat with this for a while. Then he took from his inside pocket a small, worn photograph, the only physical object from his previous life that he still carried. It showed a woman and a small girl standing in front of a low adobe building, both of them squinting slightly against desert sun, the woman's hand on the girl's shoulder. Elena had been 31 when the photograph was taken. Rosa had been 7. He looked at the photograph with the careful, controlled attention of a man who allows himself this specific thing for a specific and limited time before putting it away again, because he has learned that if he looks too long, the control gives way, and the control is the thing that keeps him functional. Elena and Rosa Callahan had died in Socorro 3 years ago, on a Wednesday night in October, in the burning of the small ranch house outside of town that Rourke had built with 14 months of hard labor and called home. The fire had been set deliberately, at 3 separate points on the structure, by men who had come in the night while Rourke was in Socorro town meeting with a lawyer about a land dispute that he now understood completely had been engineered specifically to get him away from the property that night. He had arrived back at the ranch to find it fully involved. The walls collapsed inward, the fire too far advanced for anything to be done or saved. There had been a man watching from the tree line, a man who had turned and walked away, unhurried when Rourke arrived, a man whose face Rourke had seen clearly in the firelight. Aldrich Cole's face, the wrong smile, the eyes not. He walked back up the wash to the camp. Nadia was sitting with her back against the wash wall and the Henry across her knees, watching Cole with the level, impersonal attention of a guard who takes the work seriously. Cole was sitting against the willow trunk with his eyes closed, which Rourke did not believe for a moment meant he was sleeping. He sat down beside Nadia. "I need to tell you something about Socorro," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me," she said. And he told her, not everything, because everything was not a thing he was capable of yet, but enough. Enough for her to understand what drove the engine of the last 3 years, and what Cole represented to him beyond the professional case he'd been building. When he finished, Nadia was quiet for a moment, looking at the wash wall, participating. He had reported it to the Socorro sheriff, who had taken his statement with the careful, sympathetic attention of a man who had already been told how to handle this particular case. The official finding had been accidental fire. Rourke had understood in that meeting, watching the sheriff's face, that the institutional response was closed to him. He had walked out of that office and had not stopped walking for 3 years. He put the photograph back in his pocket. He had what he had come to the San Cristobals to get: Cole, the documents, the connection to the Covenant. The next step required thinking outside every structure. He had previously considered the correct destination for what he carried. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Rourke." He nodded once. It was the right thing to say, and she had said it simply and without excess, which was the only way he could have received it. "The Covenant destroyed my family," he said, "and they're still destroying other people's families. The Harmons, your father, how many others we don't know about." He looked at Cole against the willow trunk. "He's going to tell us everything, the full structure, every name, and then we're going to find a way to get that information to someone who isn't already bought." Nadia followed his gaze to Cole. "And if there's no one left who isn't bought," she said. Rourke looked at her. "Then we burn it down ourselves," he said. and he meant it in the specific literal and metaphorical sense simultaneously. Nadia looked back at Cole, and her jaw set in the hard, particular line of a woman who has made a decision she will not be reversing. "Then that's what we do," she said. Cole talked on the second day. Not because. Rourke broke him through force. Rourke had neither the inclination nor the time for that particular method, and had found in 3 years of tracking that a man like Cole, whose entire identity was built on control, could endure physical pressure far longer than a cruder operator might assume. Cole talked because Rourke offered him the one currency that a controlled, calculating man actually values above all others: accurate information about his own situation. Rourke laid out piece by piece exactly what he had on Cole, what a federal case without compromised officials would look like, what Cole's alternatives were, and what the realistic timeline was before. Cray and the Dorado brothers located this wash, and Cole's value as a living prisoner became negative. He presented it the way he presented everything, factually, without theatrical pressure, leaving Cole to run his own arithmetic. Cole's arithmetic apparently came out in favor of talking, what he told them over the course of 4 hours, while Nadia took notes on the blank backs of the forged consolidation notices with a stub of pencil she had in her saddlebag, was more extensive and more structured than Rourke had anticipated even after 3 years of building toward this conversation. The Covenant was not simply a land speculation scheme with criminal methods. It was a 3-tier organization with a clean legal surface, a middle operational layer, and a deep structure that very few people in any tier had full visibility into. The surface tier was the Meridian Land and Resource Company, the legal entity, the registered business, the face that dealt with banks and officials and railroad representatives. Meridian was real, and its transactions were documented and largely legitimate on paper. It employed real lawyers and real surveyors and real clerks who did not know what the company's deeper operations involved. The middle tier was where Cole operated, a network of field agents, himself being the primary one in New Mexico territory, who handled the acquisition work that Meridian could not do through legal channels. Forgery, intimidation, displacement, and when necessary, permanent resolution of obstacles. This tier communicated with the surface through intermediaries who maintained deliberate insulation, cutouts, in the language Cole used, suggesting a familiarity with operational tradecraft that implied military or intelligence, history somewhere in his background. Rourke filed that away.
Santa Fe sat 140 miles northeast of the San Cristobal Wash, which on the road they were taking, indirect, off the main routes, avoiding any town where Cray might have sent word ahead, translated to 5 days of hard riding with a prisoner and the specific logistical complications that entailed. They moved at dawn and stopped before full dark, camping without fire for the first 2 nights until they were far enough from the syndicate's operational territory that the risk calculation shifted. Cole was a functional rider and gave them no trouble on the trail, which Rourke read not as cooperation, but as patience. The patience of a man who was biding his time and watching for the one moment of inattention that would change his situation. On the 3rd night, camping in a shallow canyon east of the Jornada del Muerto, Rourke woke at 2 in the morning to find Cole's wrist binding loose and Cole's eyes open in the dark, watching him. The binding hadn't been cut or worked free. One of the knots had failed. The specific knot that Rourke had tied, which meant Rourke had made an error. He lay still and watched Cole through slitted eyes for 30 seconds. Cole was measuring the distance to the horses. He was calculating the sound risk of movement on the canyon floor. He had not yet made his move because the calculation wasn't complete. Rourke sat up and drew the Remington in one motion, and the calculation became moot. "Retie it yourself," Rourke said, and tossed Cole a fresh cord. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the cord and rebound his own wrists with the focused competence of a man who does things correctly out of habit regardless of circumstance. "You sleep light," Cole said. "I stopped sleeping any other way 3 years ago," Rourke said. Cole nodded as though this was a reasonable and understandable development. They said nothing further. Nadia had woken at the sound of movement and was sitting, up with the Henry. Rourke looked at her and gave a small shake of his head, handled, "Stand down." She looked at Cole for a moment with her direct, dark eyes and then lay back down and said nothing. Outside the canyon, the desert was absolute and silent and enormous, under a clear sky thick with stars. On the fourth day, they crossed the old Camino Real at a shallow ford and entered the pine-covered foothills, south of Santa Fe. The change in vegetation was dramatic. From the spare scrub and red rock of the southern desert to tall ponderosa pine and cool air that smelled of resin and distant rain, they stopped at a stream to water the horses, and Rourke looked at the map and confirmed their position. They were 8 miles from Santa Fe's southern edge. He turned to Nadia. "We need to talk about how we go in," he said. "With Cole, we can't just ride into the city."
Mercer may have watchers on the main approaches. Nadia was looking at the pine forest around them with the assessing eyes of someone making practical calculations. "There's a mission settlement 3 miles east," she said. "San Marcos Pueblo. My father sold horses there twice a year. The mission father is an honest man. He'll keep Cole secure while we go into the city." Rourke considered this. A mission was not a jail, but an honest priest with a cooperative congregation in an isolated settlement was, in practical terms, more secure than many jails he'd seen. "Can he be trusted with what Cole represents?" Rourke asked. "Father Anselmo has been saying Mass for 30 years in a territory that the Covenant has been consuming piece by piece," Nadia said. "I think he understands the stakes better than most." They rode east toward the mission, and Santa Fe waited in the distance, and Thomas Audit was somewhere, in its streets, with 2 years of copied documents and the specific terror of a man who has been waiting in the dark for someone to come